Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. Guest on today's podcast, joining from his childhood home where he grew up, is my friend Carlos Toledo, who's joining us from Brazil. Welcome to the podcast, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And it's pretty amazing technology to just see Carlos there in Brazil. And if you look carefully, those of you that are watching via video, you can see a beautiful Brazil background in this town that he lives in. And Carlos reached out to me and just shared a little bit of a story, and that led to him being on the podcast. I'll read just a little bit of an introduction. He's 28 years old. He's gay, bisexual, queer, somewhere in there, and he may share more about that. He's grew up LDS and grew up in a really prominent Brazilian family of church pioneers. His dad's been a former Area 70. That's a 5-year calling. And my guess is his parents and his family and his grandparents have done much to build the church in Brazil. He's going to talk about sort of his journey, not being 100% straight, serving a mission, and eventually moving to Utah, where he earned a degree in communications. Carlos has really built his career in Utah. This is somebody who grew up in Brazil, but moved to Utah, lives in Utah. Most of the time, I believe he's in Brazil right now, visiting family. And for those of you that are familiar with the Salt Lake City business world, there's a magazine called Utah Business Magazine. And they did 20 in their 20s. So that's 20 top entrepreneurs, business people, men and women in their 20s. And Carlos is in that magazine and has a full page portrait of him and as well as his story. So I'm embarrassing him a little bit, but he's a corporate tech guy. But he's also probably like some of you that are in their late 20s, sort of navigating technology burnout, career burnout, trying to figure out their best path. Carlos may tell us more, but he's going to mostly focus on just his journey. I feel impressed. This might be particularly helpful to those that aren't in the United States. We have less stories of queer, I'm going to call Carlos queer for a little bit, or of Latter-day Saints that aren't American. And of course, they're from all over the world, and our church is a worldwide church. So we hope this podcast helps you, particularly if you're Brazilian or from just another country where this is just a different journey, and maybe Carlos' story will give you hope. But I'm just super grateful to have Carlos Toledo on the podcast. He's a great young man, brave, super thoughtful, super insightful, and super brave just to come on a platform and share his story. So is that okay, Carlos, for an introduction?
Yeah, totally flattered. Thanks, Richard.
Well, tell us your story, and we're glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks. I think, just coming back here to the house where I spent my childhood was very interesting and put me in a lot of reflection lately. I'm in a kind of small community. It's called Aldeia da Serra, and it's in the state of São Paulo in Brazil. And this was kind of the area where I was a child that I kind of did discover myself in a way where I did realize, like, hey, this is kind of where I was really fitting the norm, if you may. We had come to this part of Sao Paulo after living in Mexico. So I was actually born in American Fork. My dad went to go get his MBA at BYU, and my two sisters had already been born. I'm the youngest of three, and they were living in Utah, then went and lived in Jersey. And my dad would go to New York for work, and he moved us around and moved us to Mexico. And when I was about to turn 8, we moved here to Sao Paulo. My mom also was always a huge advocate of being like, we should always go back to where we're from. We should be close to our extended family. So that's kind of how we ended up here back in Sao Paulo. And yeah, it was so funny. We came back here when I was 8, and got baptized at 8, and it was a whole experience. And it was around that time too that I started realizing, like, I don't feel like I'm the same as all of my other friends. At that time, it was when High School Musical started being popular. And I remember looking at Gabriella and looking at Troy and being very confused and being like, I really think Troy's attractive. And my family's going to remember this because I would make them like get me all this High School Musical merch and get these posters of High School Musical. And little did they know Well, I don't know if they were, like, so completely in the dark too, but, little did they know that I was kind of trying to find who I was. Like Richard said, my parents were part of this, like, up and coming growing church community in Brazil. I wouldn't say they were, like, the first ones in the church here, but they were pretty present in all of their support and their service in the church, and it was something that I always found to be very thankful growing up because it really put us in good spots in terms of developing ourselves intellectually, of putting ourselves out there and meeting so many different cultures. My parents, not only my dad's calling as an Area 70, but my parents were mission presidents up in the north of Brazil, and they took me there when I was, only 10 years old, and I lived with them the 3 years of being mission presidents, and they took me not only to the mission, but they would take me to all of the conferences with the missionaries. I was the one dressed up as Santa for the Christmas conferences. So it was really, like, immersive to be, just diving into all of this. My sisters went to BYU growing up while I was still a kid, and we would go to Utah frequently to visit them. And so, growing up, the church was just part of my life, and not only in terms of just going to church on Sundays, but it was part of our values, it was part of our ethics, it was part of our everyday lifestyle. And I was very thankful for that because it put me both, as I said, developing myself, but also it was a very safe environment to be. But there's not, as much as my parents love me, and I think as every parent wants their child to feel loved and safe, it's hard to do that in a world that can be so damaging and so dangerous at points. And I think even though my parents really devoted a big time of my upbringing, putting me in good schools and good private education, it was still hard to avoid moments that were, now that I look back at it, were pretty fundamental. And one of those moments was, I remember, and it was here in this little town that we are while I was growing up in this area of where I'm at right now, present. Right down the street was one of the schools that I went to. And I remember being a kid, and when you're a kid, you have this sense of innocent happiness, right? And especially growing up in the church too as a kid, you just grow up with so many activities and so many moments to just really be happy and be a child. And I remember being in this school and I was just playing around with all these kids. And I remember clearly the first time that I was called gay. And it was just so, it kind of like shook my world as a kid. And for context, I speak three languages. We moved around for between so many countries. But when I was a kid, I grew up really shy and I grew up really, really quiet. I was a really quiet kid. And I remember the first time I got called gay as a kid in school, and it just made me want to, like, shut myself down more because it felt really oppressive. It felt really like, the tone and the way that those kids were using it against me was really a way of like, you are less than because of how we see you. And growing up, there were various moments like that because I always was a more effeminate presenting. My voice took a while to kind of thicken a little bit, and it was just not the easiest upbringing. So there were various moments in school. There were various moments in being out and about that I would find myself kind of being just seen less than. And even today, there are various moments that I join a room or, I'm in a meeting. For some reason, I'm always the youngest one in a meeting with a bunch of older executives, now in my career. And this tends to happen quite a lot where I'm just seen as less than because of maybe how I present myself or how it is. And nowadays it's very different, the feeling, than how I was as a kid. Now I take that as an empowering feeling. So I think when you asked me before we started recording, like I label myself or how I identify myself. I try to avoid from those labels because I think the word queer really is that way of bringing it back, bringing the power back to something that used to be so demeaning. And so that's kind of where I'm at and how I was as a child growing up. Yeah, I think that's kind of where we can start.
Such a great introduction. You're a great communicator, Carlos, and
Thank you.
You obviously know English really well amongst your languages. Keep sharing your story. This is just great.
Thank you. Yeah, I think and thanks for having me here. I think mostly what I really enjoy about what you do in your platform is really bridging the gap of these two very extreme different groups and finding these similarities. And I found myself kind of in that spot too. I think there's so much of the whole you can't be one without being the other, and there has to be this distinct separation. And for some people, like, yeah, that is their lifestyle. I just found myself right now, as Richard mentioned in the beginning, for those who are listening, it's more of like I just reached this point of burnout because there was so much of the conflicting of the two groups, right? Of trying to fit yourself in the church and trying to also find your identity within the queer community. And right now, I'm at a spot where I'm comfortable sharing the upbringing and where I'm at right now, and being confident in saying, like, you can always take your time because I definitely did. We left this area where we were as a child because, like I said, my parents really wanted to devote the best for me growing up, and part of that was education. So I grew up speaking English in my home with my sisters and speaking Portuguese with my parents, and found myself thriving more in an American system, kind of educational system. And so we tried going into Brazilian schools, and that didn't work out. So my parents, they invested in my education and put me in an American school that was a few hours away from here. So my mom would actually drive me every morning to go to a different city, would drive over 2 hours, almost three, after seminary. So, like, around 5 in the morning, just to go to an American school because they really believed in my capability. And so we did that for a while until we moved to this different city. And it was a much smaller city where the church there was much more communal, like everyone was neighbors with everyone, everyone kind of knew everyone. And the youth there were actually pretty big. And so they also saw that as an opportunity of, like, he can get his education and also have a good group of friends and, like, grow up with all these friends. And little did they know that this was going to be one of the pivotal moments of my life moving there, because not only did it bring a amount of, I like to call it necessary trauma because it's part of your character development, but it was also the kind of push that I needed to kind of first stop being such a shy kid and such a quiet kid, but also try to find myself and who I wanted to be. I found myself having a little crush for someone that was part of our ward. That was not the smartest way to go. Being a shy kid and a quiet kid, you don't really learn a lot of the dynamics of dating and how to flirt. And being from Brazil, that's a pretty heavy requirement because of the sexual freedom and liberty that is part ingrained in the culture here. And so I found myself in a lot of pressure of, like, I need to figure out how to how to talk to people, how to flirt with who I want to flirt, how to put myself out there. And on top of that, I had to figure out how to do that kind of privately so that I also could still be comfortable in my parents' home and go to church. And I found myself liking this kid in this ward that was just not the way to go. And one of these days, he called my dad, and he told him all about it because I had confided in this kid about my feelings for him and, like, how I felt for him. And obviously it was not reciprocated, but quite the contrary. He called my dad to even tell me all about it and even tell me about my own, like, private ventures that I was out trying to identify myself as a teenager. I think I was 14 or 15 years old. And at the time, see, there's always something happening in media that I relate back to kind of empower myself. So when I was 8 years old, it was High School Musical. When I was 14 to 15, it was Glee. And at the moment, I was watching a lot of Glee on TV. And I remember when my dad confronted me about this call, I said, you know what? This is my moment. This is my Glee moment. I need to step into this person that I had no idea who I was still, but I thought I did. And I said, you know what, let's go for it. And it didn't go as great as I thought it would be. I don't think anyone ever has a great expectation of what your parents' reaction is going to be, of, like, you kind of coming out in a way, which wasn't really even coming out. It was just a mess of pieces thrown everywhere and me not even being sure of who I was. It was just, a teenager. And yeah, my parents' upbringing didn't really prepare them for this reaction and for this discovery of who I was. And I also was a teenager full of hormones and, trying to express myself to my parents, but at the same time being that kind of obnoxious teenager where it's like, I don't want to know anything about my parents. I don't want them around me. And so it wasn't the best reaction there, but I'm thankful for how that all went down. Uh, I started therapy early on as a teenager and especially after this moment, because I think my parents were like, we don't know how to deal with this. And you also clearly don't know what you're doing. So let's put you in front of someone that can help you. And I did therapy for almost 15 years and I'm slowly going back to it. I think it's something that everyone should do because sometimes you just need to talk things out and you need some help. And I was luckily put with a professional that not only helped me piece things together in terms of, being LDS, but growing up, finding my identity as a queer person. And, you're 15, so you know that the mission's coming up, they're going to start talking about marriage. What do you do? And you start kind of panicking. And so luckily I was put in front of a person that said, you know what, you need to take your time and you need to start taking things a day at a time, which ironically is what my dad always taught me. You need to take things a day at a time. So I started doing that. And yeah, I think just tying in what Richard introduced me as, right when that started, my dad got this huge privilege and honor of serving as an Area 70. And I remember when that kind of dropped into the laps of our family, it was a mix of being very happy and honored, obviously, because you understand the importance of what that means to other people. But I remember deep down in my head, I was like, oh no, like, what now? What do I do now? And it wasn't like a negative reaction, but there's so many optics that go around the church's callings. And there's just so many more groups of people that look at you while you're serving a calling, especially in that magnitude, that you're like, I'm never going to leave this lens. And I think there are pivotal moments, which are even the moments that I'm at right now, currently in my life, which have always put me in like, okay, now you kind of need to figure out what you want to do. Now you need to figure out who you want to be because you can't just rely on your family and you can't just rely on the church forever. And I think that was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, well, you know what? I think I'm going to start taking things a day at a time, like my therapist, my dad always taught me. And I started doing things little by little, like I would still be involved in the church, but at school, I was given the opportunity to go and develop my own projects, which at the time I started developing human rights projects where we would talk about different topics. And so I would go and I would say, hey, let's, it was like a project of a few weeks and we would start talking about different topics like homophobia. What is that? What is sexism? What is racism? And I would put myself in the forefront of that in school. And so that's kind of where I started breaking out of my shell, which was putting me in a very comfortable spot.
This is great, Carlos. Just, I want to keep you sharing your story, but just being that segment of sort of getting outed by the guy calling your dad and your dad talking to you, that's
Isn't that
wild,
crazy? Yeah.
man. In 700 plus episodes, no one's ever told that story.
Yeah.
And just respect, man, for telling that story because it just helps others, and,
Yeah.
and you're pretty self-aware of yourself. You're recognizing that I'm 14, 15. It's pretty natural. Straight people, non-straight people are going to have hormones, and that's a pretty natural, organic experience. You have no sort of mentoring of how to navigate not being 100% straight and obviously and having a crush on a guy at church. And so you're just kind of trying to figure this out and bravely honest to him. And that whole thing I like your visual of the pieces kind of. And then
Yeah.
this conversation starts with your dad that you weren't ready to have, didn't really want to have, didn't want to have it that way. And sometimes stuff like this just happens. But I love that you got in therapy, and it doesn't sound like that was conversion therapy, that was helpful therapy.
Mhm.
Um, and I love that you just kinda made your way forward. So just keep sharing your story, Vic. You're doing just a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, what a recipe for disaster was that, huh? Not even the phone call getting outed, but a crush at a guy at church? Really? Like there wasn't anyone else I could go after? Yeah, it was rough, but like I said, I was always such a shy and quiet kid, so I was like, "I don't know what I'm doing." But yeah, so growing up, that was kind of what was going on. I think that part of being in school and putting myself in these, like, human rights forward projects and activism forward projects really put me in the mindset of, like, I can still kind of juggle this for a while, and I looked at going on a mission kind of as that opportunity, not as, sharing the gospel, but more of helping people. And so that's kind of what I did. I said, "You know what? I'm gonna go on a mission." And going on a mission was kind of rough because I went up to my bishop and I said, "Hey, I want to go on a mission." And like I said, the way that I present myself and also it being such a smaller city and communal, word was spread fast about this outing. And I remember my bishop, he looked at me up and down and he said, "You are not the profile of a member of the church that should go on a mission."
Wow.
And I was like, I don't know. I'm very stubborn, Richard." And I said, "Well, you know what? Watch me. Watch me and I will go." So I ended up going on a mission out of spite. And it was, like I said, my bishop didn't want me to go on a mission. I'm the son of an Area 70. We had a lot of other general authorities of the church as part of our ward and the stake, too. It was kind of that kind of, system of the stake that we had. And there was just a lot of episodes that were very, very embarrassing of people calling us out in the middle of classes of Sunday school of the sacrament meeting and it was just a lot of things in the way of me not wanting of people not wanting me to go on a mission, but I was just very stubborn. I think I take that kind of confidence from my mom. She's very much like, I'm going to do things my way and it's my way or the highway and it's going to be very good. My mom is very much that kind of perfectionist and I love it because I'm that way throughout my career and I yeah, I owe her a lot for that. And so when everyone was telling me not to go on a mission, I said, "Well, watch me." And I did. And I went. And we even had to get, a lot of ins and outs to kind of get that calling out there, but I did. I served in Guayaquil South in Ecuador. And I remember going there and sitting down with my mission presence for the first time. And I don't know, I think I was just something shifted from going into this form of teenage identity after being outed where I was like, "You know what? What am I scared of being shy and quiet about? Let me put myself out there." And I just started like putting myself out there. And so I remember sitting down with my mission president right when I arrived and I said, "Hey, I'm gay." And my mission president was like, "Okay," which was not the reaction I was expecting. And he was very Colombian, very warm, very, arms out, embraceful in all the meanings of the word. And he said, "You know what? I don't really care who you are. I really care what are you going to do now in these 2 years? Why did you want to be here?" And I said, "Well, I always wanted to do good to other people. I always want to give back. And so I wanted to be on a mission." And so he supported me. He supported me throughout the 2 years. It was a really hard 2 years, but very thankful for that. Not a remorseful person either for that experience, but I found myself in that position of like, okay, there is support here as well. As confusing as that might be for many people, it was just these small little tender mercies, if you may, where you just found yourself wanting to keep going. I think the overall theme in my life up until moving to Utah has always been like, how can I keep going with this issue of who am I and what do I do with so many external factors putting pressure on performing as as perfect as you should be, right? With this concept of the church that you have to be always perfecting yourself. And it's a lot of pressure. I developed a lot of anxiety and a lot of depressive moments throughout my life where if I didn't have those tender mercies, I don't think that I could have continued. And so I'm very thankful for people that have showed up in my life kind of whether it's just checking in and seeing how my day has been or whether actually providing me support systems and resources because I think those small gestures that you might think are small for the people that need it are pretty big. And I always will be an advocate of mental health because I found myself always struggling, always finding myself as feeling imperfect, feeling like there's nothing else for me other than this path that obviously I will not be happy with. Or also, if I completely ignore and abandon everything that I grew up with, am I going to find fulfillment in that? Am I going to be happy? It was just a lot of fear and anxiety as to what that is. I moved to Utah, and also very ironic. Like, I go and I move to Zion, right? I go and I move to this very, very predominantly church forward state. And I don't know. I think moving there really was the cherry on top of really shifting my identity and really finding myself and really being happy with who I wanted to be and who I am. I arrived in Utah and all of a sudden I found this confidence of like discovering who I was. And I don't know if it was the juxtaposition of Salt Lake being so liberal versus the rest of Utah, but I really found my people there and I really learned what being happy and joyful means, not only to your self of identity, but as a form of resistance and as a form of saying something and meaning that. And not only that, but doing that with the people that also are in the same trajectory as you have also like have to lead with these conflicting ideas of what do I do with the church? What do I do with my upbringing? Now I'm finding myself. And we all kind of found ourselves there. And it was such a beautiful experience arriving in Utah and just kind of finding my people. I developed a really good friendship with a lot of groups of people. At the time, there was only one little queer bar that we could go to, which is the Sun Trap, which is still there. And I don't know. I think I live myself with a quote that is, trees don't apologize for standing bare in the winter. And that's just, don't ever try to put yourself in the spot of I am lacking in these resources, so I just need to always be apologetic of my presence. And I learned that I couldn't do that. And like I said, I always was finding myself in different areas in my career, even in school, going for college, which was why I moved to Utah. And I had to really unlearn this like moment of going into a room and not apologizing for being there and really reclaiming back that insult back when I was 8 years old, where I was called gay, and taking that back and saying, no, actually, it's a huge privilege and it's a huge honor to be joyful and to be joyful as a queer person with my people in this space that maybe you wouldn't expect me to be in, but I am. And so now what are you going to do? And I did it all on my own. So yeah, I feel like there was a lot that I put myself through in Utah. I really don't know why. I think I put myself in my head in this kind of mission of like, I want to go, I want to find myself, and I want everyone around me to feel comfortable and happy and supportive. And we did that. Like our group of friends, we kind of started doing that. We all met at the Sun Trap and we started branching up from the Sun Trap and saying we need to start building spaces for everyone else to feel what we're feeling, which is feeling welcome and feeling embraced and feeling like we weren't excluded for being different and that we were being called out for being in a space that technically wasn't ours. And we went and we made our spaces and it felt really nice. It was a really good experience. And so what I'm explaining is that we started just meeting at the Sun Trap, from meeting to each other's homes to then meeting people that were going to help us build spaces that were available. So the opening of other queer spaces in the downtown area, providing, resources for all these new friends that were coming in, this new family that was just growing bigger and bigger, helping each other out with new job opportunities, with resources like, low income resources to find rent. And all of a sudden we became this huge network of just friends that found themselves to be family because again, we wanted everyone to feel joy in who they were. And that was a form of resistance. But resistance means you have a home, you have food, you have a job, and you're able to go after the things you want to go after. And I found myself in this duality, right? I went to Utah. I came from this very strong LDS family, and now I'm and building this community. It was very, I don't know, like I felt like I was just going 200 miles an hour, but I was just so happy doing it. And it was really fulfilling. And it wasn't my job either. I had my day jobs. There was moments I was working three jobs and a restaurant gig in the weekend, to try to make things happen. Because I was just wanting to put myself in this hyper independent state of I can't rely on my parents. I can't rely on my family. I need to kind of prove this to myself that I can make things happen. And so that's kind of where the burnout was starting a little bit. Let me drink some water. Sorry.
This is just super interesting. One of the themes I'm getting, and then Carlos needs to keep talking, is just this. You've used the word empower kind of through this episode. Way back when you said I was seen as less than, and no one, and that's how you felt. And I hope what you're doing right now is helping people not to feel that. But you kind of said that's now empowering. Really interesting. And then I'm going back to when you got outed and you look at that as a way to empower yourself. You looked at Glee, the musical Glee or the movie Glee, and you stepped into that. And then you've used the word reclaiming, the queer word, and more recently in the podcast. And this is sort of an insight into your character, these more difficult roads you're walking, but you look at them now as, you know, re, you look at it now somewhat in a positive, healthy way, and it's giving you purpose and cause and community.
Hmm.
And I thought even of when you talked at the beginning of your parents and what they did to build community as new converts in Brazil. And then I heard you talk about what you've done in Salt Lake City, and I thought, it's the same thing. You're kind of, I don't know if you feel that way, but what you're doing is somewhat similar, and you're helping people just like they were by building community and helping everybody to feel good about themselves. And
Yeah.
that's super insightful and super thoughtful. So you're kind of your LDS upbringing, that there's some challenges about that and some beauty about that. It seems like you're taking the best of what you have growing up with and taking all that into your life now. So
Yeah.
keep sharing. Just super interesting, Carlos.
Thanks. I think it's really healing to look back and piece things together about your upbringing because you're right, Richard. I owe a lot to my parents about the way that I am. And in the really positive sense. We're very similar and we're always wanting to elevate everyone around us. We always want things to be better than as we found them. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Yeah, I really do love community work in that way. I think nowadays the word community is starting to be overused a little bit for different intentions, but I just really think there's power in having more than one person together. And I was finding that in Utah. But I was watching recently actually a panel with Michelle Obama where she talks about being aware of the golden handcuffs. And it's essentially, and she's talking about it more in like a career sense. And basically, the golden handcuffs are, the expectations that kind of society puts on you in terms of the corporate sense. Like, I need to, grow in the corporate ladder. I need to start making the salary, and she was she was talking about it more in the sense of like people that don't leave a certain job and they're not growing as a person anymore because they're confining themselves in these like unset expectations of having to grow in their profession. But I feel like there's a lot more to be said about the golden handcuffs in every aspect of your life. And I started finding myself in that. I was pretty young at the time when I started experiencing burnout. I was 23 going on 24. And like I said, we were building this amazing community and things were going well. And, I started putting myself in these different handcuffs. So I said, my handcuffs of my job. I got promoted as a manager so early on in my life and started making a really good salary living in a pretty substantial place that was pretty expensive in downtown Salt Lake. I had a thriving social life, as I just mentioned. My health was going well. I had someone that I was seeing that I thought was, the person that it was for me. My family was doing well, like I was putting myself in all these handcuffs in my life. But at the end of it all, I was really neglecting who I was, and I was really doing a lot more than I should have without actually looking back at myself and being true to myself and my values and my craft. And I started finding myself kind of coming apart because I had never reached a conclusion of like, who actually am I in comparison of how I grew up to what I was doing now and what am I going to do about that? And I think there's like this overarching theme in Salt Lake where it's like this bitterness that comes from the church, and now I have to completely separate myself from that. But I couldn't do that because I loved my family. I loved my parents. I loved my sisters, and they're from, you know, they're so completely devout to that, and I couldn't just completely ignore all of that and say, "Okay, done. Let me, be this gay person spearheading things in Salt Lake." It was just really eating me alive as to, how is my family going to be in all of these handcuffs in my life? And I don't know, it felt like the face was separating from the person and the person was separating from the soul. And that's where you start feeling burnout, because if you keep ignoring who you are and being true to yourself, then you're going to find yourself at a full stop at one point. And I did. I did. I had a crazy health scare, a pretty serious health scare. I was unemployed for a long time, and I lost my jobs. I lost the apartment. I lost the set person. I started losing these friendships because I couldn't take care of myself. I couldn't put myself together again. And I think that kind of moment was where I looked at myself and I said, you can't keep avoiding who you are anymore. And you can't keep putting yourself in these handcuffs. And so little by little you start building these blocks again. And little by little you start learning how to love yourself again. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be labeled as the son of an Area 7D, or I need to be labeled as, this gay spearheader of Salt Lake and its nightlife. And, I couldn't do that. And so I started taking things little by little, but without neglecting who I was. I worked for the Utah LGBTQ plus Chamber of Commerce, and I found myself in this position of like, okay, I can still do good. I can find people of all these different areas that need support, whether in the business world or whether in the personal sense as well of their identity. And I can provide the resources for them. I could be that person. And again, like you said, like what me and my parents have similar is that we have this little bit of altruism that helps us find who we are. And that's where I got recognized by Utah Business Magazine by the things that we were doing with the chamber. And it was so rough because I was doing a lot with the chamber right when, all this political tension is happening right now. And it really taught me to really put my 2 feet on the ground and say, well, you can't go back to losing everything in your life, which was what the burnout caused. But now you even have to be even braver and stronger of who you are and where you wanna go and what you wanna do and just start piecing yourself together. So, yeah, I I think at the end of the day, what was more important was how can I find the sense of joy again? Because that is that true form of resistance that I mentioned earlier. And for many people, that's different. For many people, that is their sense of self identity, the sense of fulfillment with their job, with their career, their families. It's really different to each other, and I had to come and find that again. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. My mom, I joke with my mom because when I was a teenager, we spent so much money with braces and everything with my teeth, but it was because it was such an investment to be able to smile all the time that it would be a shame if we can't do that anymore. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, and it's, taking things at a time, and that's okay. And there's no like unspoken motto that's putting me in these handcuffs. It's myself. It's myself that I'm like limiting my growth and limiting my And whether that's, working for a certain company or for a certain habit or a lifestyle or whatever, then, those are the handcuffs that you kind of have to break out to so that you can go back to feeling joy. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Carlos, that was another really thoughtful segment, and just being brave and vulnerable. You've got it all kind of going, and then it all kind of didn't go well, and just to be able to talk about the good times on a podcast and the really rough times, and just having to lose your apartment, lose your job, to say that out loud is super brave. It's vulnerability. People find their story in your story when you're super brave like that, and just respect. There's no owner's manual for, as I listen to these stories, being queer and being LDS. And if you're straight in LDS, there's no double bind. A dad who has two gay sons talked about the double bind they're in, that, you know, you, on some level, you love the church, you love the community, you served a mission, you found joy there, there's good principles there. But on the other hand, you're trying to make your way forward, but in a way that's straight. You can't do it as a straight Latter-day Saint. And it sounds like, and so you just kind of don't have an owner's manual, and you're doing the best you can. But I love you've kind of gone back to, you seem very self-aware and sort of engaged in your own moral authority to write your own road. And there's all these voices out there telling you how to live your life. Sometimes those are voices like me, and I've tried to do less of that and just say, you've got to write your own story, Carlos. I'm going to walk with you, and you've got to figure this out, and you're going to do better in the long run if you really own your own story versus me. That there's all these voices saying you're going to stay in the church, you're going to not stay in the church, you're going to marry a man, you're going to not marry a man, you're still going to try to date women, not going to date women. I tried, even though I'm curious about how Carlos would feel about those, I'm trying not to ask those questions of people, just to let them know that I trust them to write their way forward. And I wrote down the word as you were describing that last second, is this very intentional process you're going through to make your way forward. And maybe you didn't say this, but maybe you're trying to minimize all the voices around you telling you how to live your life, and just saying, I am taking responsibility for my own moral authority in a very intentional, thoughtful way. I don't really know exactly how my story is going to end out, but I'm trying to do this the best I can, recognizing that some of the things I've made didn't work out. And I'm trying to just learn that in a positive, healthy, non-shaming way. That's just part of the mortal experience. What did I learn from that? Even though it wasn't my finest moment. And then you're super mature. I hope people remember you're 28. You kind of have this, you know, you're younger than all of our kids at this point, but you have this emotional and spiritually and intellectual maturity. Just, I'm not in the business of giving advice, but I just think you're in a great spot just to write the rest of your story because of all you've done to get to this spot, Carlos, and all the experiences you've had, and living in Brazil, living in Salt Lake City, getting very involved in activism, and people that are walking harder roads and getting involved in the Chamber of Commerce. And it's a whole new community to you. Me living in Salt Lake, I think, well, that's just my community. I would know all the buttons to push. But you've come from a completely different country, a completely different culture, and you've just thrived in Salt Lake City. So this is who you are, Carlos, the ability to just sort of get involved and make a difference for good. And so that's just super thoughtful and super helpful. More things you'd like to share?
I think just like on that note, like I'm only 28, and I think in terms of, self-identity and this clashing of, being LDS and finding your identity being queer, I think at the end of the day, it's just, pace yourself, give yourself grace, take your time, and yeah, write your own story, like do what you need to do for you. And, I think it's rough because I always put these own expectations on myself. And it's even funny because then when you realize that these expectations are kind of non-existent, you're like, wow, I was just wasting all my time. But it's not a waste. It's not a waste. It's more of like, you're taking your time to find yourself and to find that joy, which is more of what my mission has always been personally, has always been to spread joy. And regardless of who you are, and where you come from and what your orientation is, what your gender is, what your religion is. I think it's so important to always just share a smile, share a hug, share a joke. And everyone always wants to just feel loved and feel welcomed and feel special. And so that's always going to be my motto. And I feel like if there's any message that I can put out there in the world is you should try that too. Try to give yourself some grace and maybe go and smile to someone today because you never really know. You truly never really know what is happening behind someone, and their story and what they're going through. You never know. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of most of what I wanted to share today is just there's a lot that can happen, but that doesn't mean it's the end of it all. And there's a lot of power in just taking your own figurative pen and writing your own story, and you can rewrite it and you can start over and you can take pieces of what you wrote and put it into this new chapter or not. And it's really there's no one really policing that other than yourself. So
I love your I love that last segment too, Carlos. I think of Jesus when you talk like that and his ministry and our baptism covenants are bear, mourn, and comfort. That's a big part of Alma's baptism challenge at the Waters of Mormon. I kind of talk about him as our horizontal. Well, let's see, vertical is going up, so that's our relationship with God, and horizontal is going sideways. And I've always felt like that part of our baptism covenant is so important of the things that Carlos just invited us to do, how we treat people, kindness and empathy and compassion and helping people feel good. And some of the things I've learned from my queer friends is that's sometimes a superpower for them because they've walked a more difficult road. They sort of get this space and see people that I might not see and others don't see. And so that's been something that I've tried to learn from my queer friends is to have a better radar map for others walking a harder road. Because I look at the life of Christ and how everybody that people in power said he shouldn't be hanging with and kind to and inviting to dinner. And he did all of that. And he took a lot of flack for that from the people in charge. But he also did what you did is people that were being seen as less because he was proximate, invited them. And, he did that. He's super self confident and super knew how to do that and not worried about what other people thought. And I love that you're following his example, Carlos, of doing that. And it's inspiring. A question came to mind. Are you okay with some questions?
yeah, go ahead.
Some that, are queer kind of get angry at the church because they've heard unkind things about them, or if they feel their best path forward is being a same sex marriage, there's no space for them. And, so some, as you know, and you would know this firsthand. And how do you get through the anger? If you felt anger, because I think anger is a logical human emotion that comes from pain. I think it's a secondary emotion. And I think I would never tell you, Carlos, don't be angry. But it's sort of a question like, how do you get through the anger? And there may be listeners that are really angry now at the church. And how do you get through the anger if you've walked that road? What would your advice be to your younger self if you've walked that road, or others that are listening?
Hmm. I would say like the anger is a pretty normal reaction, especially once you learn who you are and what the church's promise at the end might not be for you. It's a really hard reality. I remember I was being a missionary actually when I learned that at the end of it all, even if I am queer and I can live this life and, receive all the promises of God and be a faithful member. But if I marry a man, then even at the end of it all, going to the celestial kingdom, at the end of it all, the promise is not reserved for me. That's a harsh reality. And so I don't blame those that get angry because it's rough where you devote your life to something and then you you face a reality like not for you. But I would say my advice of, working through that is remind yourself that it's not everything. It's not the entirety of your life doesn't have to revolve around the church. I think the church has served as a resource and a tool, but there are so many other ones out there. And so there's just a plethora of other things that you can utilize to find your sense of purpose, of life, of your answers to life's questions. And so I think my advice is maybe go and find what you really want to be finding versus what you've been told to have to use. And that can really put yourself out of that anger mentality because at the end of the day, there is revelation that changes things in church. That's true. But the thing about the church and religion and the doctrines is that it's pretty set stuff. And so and you're not the one that's gonna change that. You know, unfortunately, that's like not the system that allows it to change as easily as one would want. So go find something else. And that's okay. Like, I think there's like this angle of like, if I go, I have to completely be against, and there is this need of like belittling everything else, but there's not. There's so many other religions out there. Imagine if everyone had to go and be angry at everyone. That's just so rough. Then what do people do with all these different religions that you clearly can't be part of or that you don't want to? Then you just go and you find something else, and that's okay. Again, the only person that's really policing you there by telling you that it's not okay, that you have to try to force the religion to change is yourself. So why are you still putting yourself in this situation? Go and just find something else. And it's not as easy. I am saying this, but it's not an easy thing to do. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that for a lot of people. So for those who listen, to me saying this and they're like, "Oh, well, clearly, that's such a," it's not. It's not an easy thing to do. But it's that mentality of like, why am I going to keep putting myself in a situation that's hurting me?
It's great answer. I thought you could handle that question, so great answer. And I would give very similar advice. I probably 10 years ago would have invited all my queer friends just to try to stay in the church and make it work. And I've listened to so many stories and so much pain that I've stepped away from that position. I'm active in the church. My wife and I hold a calling in our local YSA ward as a ministering couple, and we love that. But I've just recognized that for my queer friends, I'm just going to be okay with them self determining their best way forward. And then if they feel like their best path is to not fully participate in the church, I'm not going to make them the hero one day and the villain the next day. And I'm going to try to do what Carlos
Mhm.
suggested is just take what you can with you. And, your belief in God, if you can keep that with you, belief in a savior. Our doctrine doesn't just say God stops loving you if you separate yourself from the church and you don't go anymore, or Jesus no longer cares about you.
Yeah.
Take those with you and do like Carlos said, maybe find another faith community or something else and sort of deconstruct in a way and then reconstruct consistent with your conscious and your moral compass and some of the principles that Carlos has shared. And we don't have a lot of content in the church to sort of say, if you're going to leave the church, these are thoughtful ways to do it, principle-based ways to leave the church. We don't produce that content. I'm not suggesting we do, but there's just a lot of ways if you're separating yourself from the truth, the church to do that. And I'm not. And so I just thought your answer was really good and very thoughtful and very principle based. And so thank you for that. Tell us if you've got more time. I'm curious if what it's like being queer just generally in Brazil versus the United States. So I don't, is it easier being queer in Brazil generally? This is sort of even outside of the church. It's just Brazil accepting queer people versus United States accepting queer people. Tell us about that.
You know what's so funny? Brazil is very ironic in that where Brazil is the number one country that kills transgender people.
Oh, great.
And but at the same time, homophobia is illegal to the point where they will arrest you for just saying a homophobic remark.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's always been a very extreme dichotomy here, where there's a very strong Catholic religious presence in the upbringing of the country, but at the same time, there's a very strong, like, sexually forward and liberating culture, and so it's confusing at points. I feel like right now Brazil is at a point where they deal with these topics in such a nicer light, where they're spearheading now all these, diversity and equity topics. But it's still, an issue where you can feel very unsafe and be in danger in various places. And the country itself has a very different structure in terms of, basic education and resources being provided in different areas of the country. And so there is there's still, a lot of danger existing for those who are identifying as queer in Brazil. In terms of the church, it's still, I still see a lot of the old-fashioned way of interacting, which is what you were saying, like, if someone were to leave right now, it's very frowned upon, and it's still this, like, extreme circumstance of, like, well, you can kind of figure it out and still stay at the church. I would say the church has worked a lot from that, but you still see it a lot because of how the country is kind of established. There is, as similar as America, there is still a lot of the very extreme left-right ideologies fighting with
Yeah.
each other, and so you see that present a lot in the church community too. And so, it's, again, like, you just kinda have to figure out how to live your life without being always in constant conflict externally with other people or with yourself.
Super thoughtful. I've thought of Elder Suarez, listeners, and those of you at LDS know that we
Mhm.
have an apostle who's Brazilian, and I was super excited about that. And I've wondered, he's not going to tip his hand on how he feels about LGBTQ because I think he's going to let Elder Oaks lead on that. But I've just wondered on some of these apostles that aren't from the Intermountain West, if and have lived in. I don't know anything about Elder Suarez's background except he's from Brazil and
He's a
younger.
good
He's kind of
friend.
my age, and I
He's a
just
good friend of the
wondered,
family.
is he? I figured he might be, and just what will it be like if Elder Suarez is leading the church one day? And I think it's good though if you're queer, not to make. You've got to get on with your life. You can't sort of put your life on hold thinking the church might change. And I think you can't make decisions like if you're going to go into same-sex marriage. I think you need to do that based on your own moral compass, your own personal revelation, and not say to yourself, well, the church one day will catch up with that and say that's okay.
Yeah.
But I do get curious about, because where we are as a church, I feel like there's just too much pain. Pain to me is an example of where the gospel of Jesus Christ, or I, I, you, I'm mumbling now, but one of our guests wrote a book called "When Church is Hard" at Deseret Book. He's a physician. His point is, as a physician, when people open up about pain in the body, it's really helpful for a physician to know to be addressed. But sometimes we don't always allow that in the church for anybody, queer people saying this is really hard. This is my road, and we sometimes gaslight you or say, "Well, just read your scriptures more." Or, it
Yeah.
isn't that hard. Just hang on till the next life. Everything will be fine. But you've got 7 decades to live as a queer Latter-day Saint. So I just think pain is our friend, to see that within our church and be open to revelation our senior leaders might have received down the road to better support queer people. That's kind of where I am. Any thoughts on any of that, Carlos?
Well, I agree with you. I think not even just because of the church, I think people hold on to pain for a long time, and that physically, not just spiritually, but that physically tears you down with your health. And I think that's what happened to me when I went through all that burnout, was that I kept hanging on to this pain and frustration and
Mhm.
uncertainty, and it got to a point where I just couldn't handle all those handcuffs in my life, and I ended up losing a lot of what I had worked so hard for, my independence in all these different areas in my life. And so I agree with you. I think we always need to be acknowledging pain, and not only acknowledging our, like, once you acknowledge your pain, you start realizing that you're not the only one that has pain as well. And so I think it's just a form of empathy towards who's next to you. Yeah, yeah, it's rough because I think by moving, I'm so grateful that we moved around a lot in my upbringing. Like, sometimes I wish I would have just, grown in the same neighborhood, never left, and lived that kind of life, but I didn't. I moved around a lot, and I'm thankful for that because it showed me how so many different people live in different ways and different lives and different ideologies, and they're happy, they're joyful. And like I said, that was my mission. But when it comes to pain, I also have seen a lot of that. I've seen how pain really can destroy someone. And it's sad because sometimes they don't allow themselves to. And it's rough because I don't know, sometimes there's comfort in just keeping your pain and you don't want to change that. And at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do for someone. But it's sad because there's, like you said, there's 7 more decades of being a queer Latter-day Saints. What are you gonna do? You're just gonna let that destroy yourself? And for me, when I lost everything, I had a glimpse of what that felt like, and it was so dark and sad and lonely, and I don't ever wanna feel like that ever again. And I think when you feel that, it's just you also don't want anyone to feel that. I do well, at least me. I guess it's just like me and my parents. It's our way of being, right? We always wanna be, like, helping each other out around us, but, yeah, I don't ever wanna feel that again. And so you work daily to never feel that kind of darkness and sadness and pain.
Kind of glad that you went through all this in your 20s in a way. I rewatched Apollo 13. I've referenced that on the podcast, and Gene Kratz, the mission commander, gets up as that mission was trying to get to the moon, and then everything went sideways, and it was just to try to keep those astronauts alive, to get them back to their families. And in the darkest moment, he stood up and he said, "This is going to be our finest moment." And I love that. And I've thought about, that applies to you, Carlos. I think your finest moment may have been your hardest moment when everything sort of collapsed and your kind of worst nightmare became a reality career-wise in your personal journey. But your ability, I think that our greatest test of character, and I think that's how God looks at us, is I don't think he's disappointed that we get in these tough spots. I think he's more interested in our character of what we learn from him and how we can move forward. And I think Satan's real, but I think one of the things he does is try to keep us in these dark spots and say there's no hope, or have us look backwards in a whirlpool of lie and self-loathing and the mistakes we've made, whether they're business mistakes or personal mistakes. And he wants us to just feel like we're trapped and that our future's forever changed because of what we've just gone through. But Carlos, you're a great example of where you didn't do that. And you just, like, in your darkest moments, man, and you've talked about them career-wise, personally, you got through that, and you're in a great spot. And it's possible for listeners, for all of us that get in a really bad spot. We talk about the wounded healer. A Catholic priest talked about a wounded healer, and just to become so much more effective in helping other people because you've walked those really dark roads yourself. It's back to your ability to be a superpower to just relate to and give other people hope, Carlos. And you're not my age coming on the podcast talking about this. You've got, I just think I don't want to put pressure on you to save the world, but I would guess there's a lot of people are going to listen to this. Um, that you've helped. And I just think if we had you on the podcast in 30 years, that you're gonna have a whole lifetime of sustainably helping other people in a way that's sustainable so you can take care of yourself personally in your career. But so much of what you do is just helping other people feel like they're loved and belonged. And so respect for who you are and the life you're living and your ability to help people. And the God I believe in loves somebody like Carlos, that because I think we are his arms and hands, and you are doing that work. And I don't worry about where you're going to be in the next life, Carlos, because I can tell your heart, and it's not perfect, and 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 my heart, and we're not perfect, but I think you're not doing this for an eternal reward. You're just doing this because this is who you are. And
Mhm.
isn't that the coolest level of doing good things? Is not because you're thinking of building some mansion in the next life, but just because this is who you are, Carlos. You just want to help people. So thank you
Yeah.
for being you.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. And I do wanna emphasize that, like, when you reach that point of pain that you feel like you're in this very dark spot, there are moments where you feel like God has left me. You feel punished. And yes, we are his arms and everything. And for those who are listening that maybe don't even believe in God, I think at the end of the day, this is very helpful because even if you don't believe in God and you reach this point of darkness and you feel like the world or the universe or God has punished you or has abandoned you, what really is the changing factor of it all is what you decide to do. Because at the end of the day, even, or, the best job can be lined up or the best opportunity can come up. But at the end of the day, it's your call to wake up every day and to change if you want to change and to write your story if you want to write your story. And so, yeah, like I love helping people out, but at the end of the day, it's your call. It is your call. And it's rough to hear that because sometimes we feel very hopeless when we're at those moments of darkness and our pain, but it really ends up just being you and yourself. Maybe that's not the answer some people wanna hear right now, those that are looking for, some kind of solution, right, of for whoever is in that moment of pain right now, but that's really what it comes out to be. Because at the end of the day, it's just you. It's you with yourself.
It's great. Anything you'd like to say in closing, Carlos?
Be kind to one another. Always be kind to one another, and if you're able to share a smile or a hug, please do. Also, they're just, you know, we're all not that different than each other. I think there's a lot of distinguishing factors, that make each other unique, but at the end of the day, we're really not that different. And so once you remember that, just remember to be kind and spread some joy. Spread some joy to each other. Just shoot a smile or a hug.
Would you speak in Portuguese to a young closeted queer kid listening that knows Portuguese better than English? Just
Yeah.
speak to some closeted kid, Brazil kid, and what you'd say to him or her in Portuguese. And listeners, hang on for this.
Yeah. Para os que estão ouvindo agora, se você sente que você não tem esperança, ou você sente que não tem solução, que não tem mais para o seu futuro do que já você sente que foi planejado por você, para você, sinta que tem poder em tomar decisões, tem poder e tem alguém que consegue te amar e essa pessoa é você mesmo. Você sempre vai poder encontrar amor em outras pessoas, no seu trabalho, na sua família, mas no final das contas, quem precisa se amar é você mesmo. Então comece a se amar e tome essa decisão todos os dias. That's it.
That was pretty. Carlos Toledo, thank you for reaching out, being on the podcast. You're a good man. You give me hope for the future. And thanks for just being on the podcast. Thanks our listeners for listening. And this will be on YouTube. It'll be on the audio platforms we traditionally publish. But please share this with others so we can better come together as the same human family and see each other like Carlos is inviting us to see as the same human family. So this is Carlos Toledo and Richard Ostler signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard.